if we can say that these classical authors who have less manuscripts, if we can say that this book was written by Plato, this book was written by Aristotle or by Socrates, and we have more manuscripts of the Christian gospel, my goodness, therefore, we have no reason to doubt the fact that they are faithfully the same, substantially the same, complete and uncorrupted with the manuscripts written by the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves. Hello, welcome to Conferences on the True Religion. I'm your speaker and host, Father John Okerelu. We finally will consider the last point on the documents of the gospel, and this is the completeness of the documents of the gospels. A historical document is complete, entire, uncorrupted, if it has not been changed in its main parts. Example, the Constitution of Nigeria would not be complete if someone tampered with it, subtracted or added whole paragraphs, or even small phrases, or even one word, which would be necessary to bring out the full sense of the document. Now, any tampering with the Gospels in their essential parts would have been impossible. Why would I say so? I'll tell you why. These books were widely disseminated, translated into many languages, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and read in public and private. From childhood, priests and people were familiar with the words and expressions and watched jealously over them, even as we do over the expressions in the Our Father or the declarations of independence of our nation. We are so familiar with the phrasing of the prayer and the document that any change in them will be at once detected and loudly and universally condemned. It was for this reason that the heresies which arose in the early days of Christianity were bitterly denounced. The heretics changed either the wording or the correct interpretation of the documents, and immediately there was a public and universal protest. Such tampering with the documents aroused strenuous and earnest and learned defenders, just as anyone who should introduce a variation into the constitution of our dear country Nigeria will be publicly and bitterly condemned by the citizens and pronounced guilty of heresy against the documents on which are founded the rights of the Republic. There is overwhelming evidence in the writings of the fathers of the church. The fathers, first of all, are those early church teachers who took the Gospels, explained the Gospel to their hearers, whether it be their disciples or to be lay faithful. The fathers of the church, early church fathers, are successors of the apostles. And what they often did was that they would take the gospel in hand and read out chunks of it and interpret the right meaning. That is how the church has always done. The interpretation of scripture, as St. Peter said, is not left to each individual to do as he wants. By the way, that has led to so many false churches today. That is the truth, where everyone interprets scripture as he likes. But not so it was from the very beginning. So these church fathers, what they would do is that they would take the Bible, the sacred scripture rather, read chunks of it and interpret what those verses meant. And they virtually did all of scripture in such a way that even when the original manuscripts of scripture were lost, because they had interpreted the same scripture, these different verses, the whole verse of scripture, they have read it out and interpreted it. It was as good as reduplicating the manuscripts, original manuscripts of the Gospels. Were the Gospels tampered with, corrupted between the time they were written and the year 100? Like I just said, it is true that we have no manuscripts belonging to the apostolic age, that is, the manuscripts handwritten by the apostles themselves, or the one that just followed immediately after the one written by the apostles, because the apostles wrote one copy and then they had secretaries who would write other copies, like they didn't have a photocopying machine. So for instance, St. Paul spoke and he had secretaries who wrote down his epistles. So that was what I mean, that when the apostles themselves wrote, they had secretaries who would write out many copies to send out to the different, you could call it parishes, in the territory where they were in. So those manuscripts have been lost, it is true, but we do not need them because the fathers, the early Christian teachers of that age, and their successors were connected either immediately or mediately with the apostles themselves. And they took care that any teaching not clearly proved to rest on the words of the apostles should be rejected. Therefore, from this manuscript evidence, we are face to face with a marvelous conclusion that the Gospels as we have them today are substantially the same as the Gospels which left the hands of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'll give you a comparison of this evidence with the evidence in favor of the classics. No one denies that the writings of Caesar, Livy, Demosthenes are historical documents. We unhesitatingly assign the writings of Sophocles, Plato, and so on to the author's name and say that these writings are substantially the same as those which left the hands of their writers. Yet, look at the evidence on which we base our assent. Of Asclepius, we have 50 manuscripts, all incomplete. Of Sophocles, we have 100 manuscripts, of which only 7 are good, and so on and so forth. Over against this manuscript evidence for the classics, set 12,000 manuscripts of the 4 Gospels, of which nearly 2,500 in the original Greek, and all in substantial agreements. So despite the fact that we say, if we can say that these classical authors who have less manuscripts, if we can say that this book was written by Plato, this book was written by Aristotle or by Socrates, and we have more manuscripts of the Christian gospel, my goodness, therefore, we have no reason to doubt the fact that they are faithfully the same, substantially the same, complete and uncorrupted with the manuscripts written by the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves. What you might say on the synoptic gospels, remember we saw earlier the synoptic gospels are the first books or the first gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The reason we call them synoptic, just a recap, is because they have certain similarities with themselves, and yet we still notice certain dissimilarities. You might ask, why? The first 3 gospels are called synoptic gospels because of what I just said. These gospels often narrate the same incidents, but not without certain peculiarities proper to each document. The general arrangement of the subject matter is the same in all, but with some differences. At times, the writers use matter which is common to all, narrating the same happening in the very same words. These similarities occur most of all when the writers are given the words of Christ. Now, the problem. How are we to explain the similarities and dissimilarities in the first 3 Gospels in argument, arrangement of material, and expression? I'll tell you why. There was a common source of these 3 documents. This was the teaching of the apostles in collective. In teaching the people, the apostles would use certain definite catechetical methods which their disciples would repeat after them, and which the evangelists adapted according to each one's scope and purpose. These instructions of the apostles were not by word of mouth alone, but were soon committed to writing. Hence, the similarities as well as the dissimilarities in the synoptics as far as they affect the subject matter and its arrangement were due to the oral teaching of the apostles, which each evangelist except John wrote down as he thought best. This would explain the similarities and also the dissimilarities because each evangelist adapted the common matter to his audience and to his purpose. Verbal similarities are accounted for from the fact that the oral teaching was written down in Greek, and since it was practically the same teaching all the time, the same expressions would naturally occur. Yet, one person might put down more, another less, in accord with his purpose. Hence, there would be the similarities. Mark and Luke and the one who translated Matthew into Greek used these written documents as they thought best, but not in such a way that each writer exclusively depended on the same document as the others. Now, having seen how to prove the fact that the documents of the gospel are true historical documents by proving the genuineness of the documents, the trustworthiness of the authorship, the authors themselves, and to show that the gospels are complete and are uncorrupted, incorrupt, we'll now show in the next episode we'll speak about Christ, the person Christ and his doctrine. Stay tuned. May God bless you.